Hey, this is my presentation for the Philosophy of Science module. I've decided to do a video on falsification, and I won't keep you around for too long, but I hope you find it quite interesting. And without further ado, we'll just jump straight into it. So what is falsification? It's a way of discovering what is true in science, and it's a way of describing what's true in science in a more rigorous and discerning way than was proposed before falsification was around. It was proposed by this man on the left, Karl Popper, in 1934. And if you could summarize falsification very briefly, instead of finding as many ideas as possible to show that a hypothesis is true, it's actually more accurate, more rigorous, more discerning, more insightful to find as many ideas as possible that show a hypothesis is false. You can have 1,000 pieces of evidence that prove that a hypothesis is true, but that's nowhere near as valuable as finding one piece of evidence that shows a hypothesis is actually untrue. So, to clarify things a little bit, I'll show you an example. So imagine someone proposes this hypothesis that all swans are white. This is quite a sensible thing to say, to be honest. There are a lot of white swans around. I've never seen a swan that isn't white, personally. And for much of science's history, we would prove this hypothesis by looking for as many white swans as we could. And the more white swans you find, the more likely your hypothesis is to be true. So, the hypothesis all swans are white is more provable if we can show there are lots of white swans about. However, there is a plot twist to this. Well, the sensible hypothesis that all swans are white is actually incorrect. There are black swans around. So what does this mean for our original hypothesis that all swans are white? Well, it's quite evident that that hypothesis is wrong. Another way of putting it is that our original hypothesis was false. We have falsified it. And all the white swans that we saw to confirm our original hypothesis that swans are white actually didn't mean that much. Finding one black swan is much more valuable in terms of scientifically investigating our hypothesis than finding 1,000,000 white swans. Finding one black swan is worth so much more than finding all the white swans in the world. And forgive me if I'm being slightly patronising, but I'm a sucker for language and its origins and the meaning of words, and just to emphasise what falsification means. Because we showed that the hypothesis all swans are white is false, it's been falsified. This is what falsification is. And it's really important in establishing what's true and untrue, not only in science, but life more generally in other disciplines that go beyond science. But alas, this is the Philosophy of Science module, so for now, why is falsification important in science? As I've said before, falsification is important because it's a way to view science probably more accurately than any perspective on the truth of scientific claims before. And one of the valuable parts of falsification is that it actually overcomes the problem of gaining knowledge, specifically scientific knowledge in this context, through the process of induction. And it's because falsification doesn't work through induction, finding cases where what you think is true to be true. It works in the opposite direction. It works through deduction. It goes back to our case of the swans. We had the hypothesis all swans are white, and through induction, through finding white swans, we thought that hypothesis was truer and truer, and that it had more and more evidence behind it. But falsification says no. Because there are black swans, you can deduce that that hypothesis is untrue. Falsification is also important because it's more truth-preserving than what came before it. It's more truth-preserving than the scientific method that we're pretty used to at this point. Not only because I've gone on about it in this presentation, but because we were taught about it at school. And it's what a lot of modern science is still based on. It's based on verification and repeated observation of a hypothesis that you have. And falsification is important because philosophically it's stronger than what came before it. An idea is stronger if it stands up to repeated scrutiny instead of repeated observation. And to clarify this idea a little bit, we can use the analogy that an idea is like a house, and a well-built house will stand up to earthquakes, adverse weather, rain, wind. It will stand up to pestilence, it will stand up to termites, and it would stand up to someone trying to hit it down with a sledgehammer. Falsification is a little bit like a sledgehammer, and a hypothesis is a bit like a house. An idea is like a house. If the idea is strong, it can stand up to the scrutiny that falsification tries to hit at it. The more I try and knock down an idea, and the more it still stays standing, then the more likely it is that idea is probably true. But what if we put falsification under another hammer? What if we put it under the hammer of a judge? Would falsification stand up on trial? What if falsification was accused of being a bad idea? What would a defendant say in defence of falsification? What would a prosecutor say in objection to falsificationism? We'll go over some objections that falsification might come up against in a court. We'll just go over them quite quickly. Some will say that falsifiability is a very pessimistic view of science, because it doesn't actually affirm anything, it only disconfirms things. We only eliminate ideas that seem to be quite useful. It's almost a destructive force. If we don't actually prove anything, we just disprove everything, then we're kind of left with nothing, which isn't a nice place to be in. Other prosecutors could say falsification's too simplistic. We need to consider other factors when we assess how useful and true a scientific idea is. And they are arguably completely right. We need to look at how useful a scientific idea is, the number of utilities a scientific idea has, how many times can we use it for different things. We have to consider its historicity, how historically valuable a scientific idea is. We need to consider its longevity. It can be analysed through many different lenses. Does it stand up to the scrutiny of physics, as another example? And falsification can do away with these quite useful perspectives on weighing up the value of a scientific idea. One more interesting objection is that falsifiability can dismiss valid and useful scientific theories because they have unfalsifiable claims in them. Some scientific theories are based on completely unfalsifiable concepts, and one example of that is Thomas Hobbes' idea of physicalism, which, to explain very briefly and very simply, Thomas Hobbes was quite radical for the time he lived in the 1600s. He believed that people were no different to clocks, ultimately, and that all of reality, all of the universe was physical, mechanical, that the human being was a very sophisticated piece of clockwork, a plant is a somewhat sophisticated piece of clockwork, a rock is a less sophisticated piece of clockwork, that we are ultimately reducible to physical parts, clockwork parts, atoms. But his idea is completely unfalsifiable, because we'll never be able to fully see the nature of reality. But does that mean Thomas Hobbes is wrong? Not necessarily, yet falsification would do away with his ideas. It would be quite audacious for a philosopher of science to walk up to a well-renowned physicist and say, "Your ideas are redundant because they're based on unfalsifiable ideas." Because much of physics is based on unfalsifiable ideas, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. For the sake of argument, we'll go over the defences that falsification might have in a courtroom. People who defend falsificationism might say that falsifying ideas isn't pessimistic at all, it's actually an optimistic thing to do because it speeds up the rate of progress that we discern what's true from what isn't true. It's a way of whittling down ideas far more quickly than through the old scientific method. Deducting ideas and disproving ideas is far quicker than trying to verify them time and time again. It's a lot quicker to try and find one black swan than to try and find 1,000 white swans. The scientific method is far too simplistic. It's not deduction that's simplistic, it's induction that's simplistic. By showing somebody, look at all the white swans I can see, we're completely missing out the possibility of black swans. Falsification and deduction, finding black swans to disprove the white swan idea, is a much more rigorous way of testing a scientific idea than any other alternative we have, which is quite a strong refutation of our second objection. It's not induction that's strong, it's deduction that is rigorous and strong when it comes to testing scientific ideas. Some who defend falsification will admit that falsification dismisses hypotheses. Some of these ideas might actually be useful, but it's a price worth paying because falsification seems to be very useful at being able to separate strong science from weak pseudoscience, and it's also quite useful at being able to point out proto-science, areas of thought and schools of thought that might evolve into modern sciences. Before I wrap up this video, I just think it's worth looking into something Karl Popper said, and I like this quote because it opens up a can of worms that we'll try and chew over very briefly. Karl Popper said that scientific procedure must be designed in such a way that it does not protect any statement in science against falsification. What does Popper mean when he says this? Well, it leads to an interesting idea called demarcation, which is how do we demarcate science from pseudoscience or from non-science, and based on what Popper says, if a school of thought has falsifiable ideas and statements, if it's built on falsifiable ideas, it's very likely to be scientifically sound and well fleshed out from a scientific perspective. And it can lead to some interesting discussions about how some sciences are more falsifiable than others. For example, biology is more scientific than physics from a falsification perspective, because it's a lot easier to falsify biological theories than physical theories. For example, in physics, the idea that black holes exist was a theoretical idea for a very long time, simply because black holes by their nature are invisible to the human eye. From our humble earthly perspective, we couldn't actually prove black holes existed, we only inferred they existed because light seemed to bend and disappear at certain points in the universe. It's only very recently we've actually been able to verify black holes exist, and there's this absolutely remarkable picture of a black hole that scientists produced several years ago. And because of our ever-advancing technology, our ever-advancing equipment, we've been able to verify more strongly and more scientifically, rigorously, one could say, that black holes do exist. But this idea in physics was theoretical for a long time and difficult to falsify. In contrast to this is an even more outlandish idea, which is resurrecting the dodo. The dodo was a bird that was hunted to extinction in the 15 to 1600s, and there are biologists who believe that dodos could be constructed, replicated, and nurtured in a laboratory, and that dodos could exist again. And the hypothesis that creating dodos is possible is quite easy to falsify, just because doing such an experiment in the lab will either prove or disprove the hypothesis that we can make dodos from DNA segments that are left over. We either have a dodo or we don't. We either falsify the hypothesis or we don't. So it's actually easier to falsify this biological idea than the physical idea of a black hole, just for various reasons. One of them being, it's easier to falsify something that's in front of your eyes than to falsify something that exists beyond your eyes, vis-a-vis a black hole. But this actually does lead us to some problems. Some schools of thought we don't want to consider as science are falsifiable. Astrology is an example of this. Astrology makes predictions about the future, which can be disproved if a prediction doesn't come true, and by Popper's worldview is falsifiable and scientific. and that's just not true. But perhaps Karl Popper himself would be okay with these objections. He has a quote here that I really appreciate. All life is problem solving. And Popper's worldview is part of that lifelong process of solving the problems that we come across. Where there's a problem, life is to be made there. Thanks for watching this video. These are some references to the ideas that I've brought up in this video, if you'd like to do more research into it. And look out for the swans.